Good afternoon, and thanks for joining our webinar today. My name is Jay Parsons. I'm a professor and farm and ranch management specialist in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and the operational leader for research in the Center for Agricultural Profitability. Today is part of the Center for Agricultural Profitability's weekly webinar series, which usually happens every Thursday at noon Central Time. A full schedule of all the center's webinars, including recordings of past webinars, is available on our website at cap.unl.edu. And on your screen, you see a schedule of our immediately upcoming webinars, and we invite you to join us for any of those that interest you. In today's webinar, we focus on the value of manure. Whether you have a surplus of manure that needs to be moved off the farm, or you are a crop producer considering adding manure, the next hour should have some great information for you. We will hear about factors that impact manure value, nutrient availability in different types of manure, how to calculate the value of manure, and what it means to mind your manure manners. Presenting today, we are glad to be joined by two leaders of Nebraska Extension's Animal Manure Management team. Leslie Johnson is an Extension educator for Animal Manure Management. Hi, Leslie. Thanks for joining us today. And Amy Schmidt is an associate professor and animal manure management specialist. Thanks for joining us, Amy.
Yep, thanks for having us on here, Jay.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Leslie, who's going to present the first several slides, and we'll be back at the end for a Q&A session. I invite you to type your questions into the question box or the chat box, either one, while they're presenting, but we'll handle all those questions at the end of the program. So Leslie, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Jay. You're hearing me okay, I assume?
Yes, we are.
All right, wonderful. So as Jay said, I'm Leslie Johnson. I am the manure educator for the state of Nebraska. I have a statewide responsibility, but I am actually not based in Lincoln. I am based up in Concord in the northeast part of the state. So if you need to get a hold of me, our contact information will be at the end of the talk. And Amy's going to join us in a little bit, or talk with us in a little bit, but I'll just jump right into the topic at hand. I'm going to talk about what makes manure valuable and then how to determine that dollar value that you might be able to either sell your manure for, or that you might be able to reduce your fertilizer costs by. So then I'll turn it over to Amy, and she's going to talk more about how much nitrogen is available from manure, particularly in the first year or two, and then how to mind your manure manners. So when you're talking about manure's value, you have to think about a variety of factors. Most likely, most folks think of the fertilizer nutrients as manure's MVP or MVPs if there's more than one, or when there's more than one. But it takes more than just one star player to make a really great team, as we all know. As such, manure wouldn't be as great as it is without other factors like added organic matter that you get when you're applying manure, or the microbial community that's added to your field with that application. The value of all of these players does depend on how much nutrients are in the manure, but they also depend on how much that crop actually needs of those nutrients and what the condition of the soil is, as well as whether or not you're going to supplement that manure with commercial fertilizer to make up for imbalances in that manure. Some manures have a lot more phosphorus as compared to nitrogen. Others have more nitrogen as compared to phosphorus. All this to say, if you really don't need something, just how valuable is it? If you've got a really great team already, meaning your soils are already really wonderful, are you willing to pay a lot of money to bring in that manure that is our star player, so to speak? Or to turn that around, if your soils really need nutrients, you could really use that added organic matter or that microbial life. Do you really want to sell that product that could help you build that soil back up? So nutrient value and the ability to offset those commercial nutrient costs is pretty easy to put a dollar value on. And we'll get to that in a minute as far as actually how to do that. But I want to take a minute and discuss some of manure's valuable assets that aren't so easy to put a number on. A lot of people think of manure as a water quality problem. We've been trained to think that way because we think of pollution and manure are going hand in hand. But it actually can have a benefit to water quality. Fields that have been receiving manure tend to hold more water. They can handle a lot more infiltration during a rain event. So they can manure can actually decrease runoff during rainfall compared to those fields that didn't receive that manure. Additionally, fields that haven't received manure for a number of years, maybe 5 to 10 years, often notice a yield bump over areas that haven't received manure. And while we really don't understand exactly what that caused that, we think that it's probably due to that microbial community that's introduced along with that manure that makes things more available to that crop. So that's something that to think about too, that if you get that yield bump, then you're gaining more from that manure than what you can really put a dollar value on up front. And the last value that certainly can't be overlooked this year with fertilizer prices and availability so unfavorable in many places is the fact that manure is a local nutrient that doesn't have to be hauled in on trains, trucks, or ships from other places. Farmers applied nutrients to crops that were then used to feed the animals. Obviously, the animals produce the manure, and so the manure that resulted from that can and should be recycled back onto fields to grow more feed for more animals. And we have this nice circle that is nice and local, and you don't have to haul things in. Now, not all manures are created equal. Different animals eat different feeds in different proportions, and so they produce different manures. You'll notice in this that swine slurry is pretty similar in the amount of available nitrogen and phosphorus as compared to beef manure that has quite a lot less nitrogen available compared to the amount of phosphorus that you apply. And the only way you really know what nutrients you have, and therefore whether or not they're balanced for what your crop truly needs, is to sample that manure. So send that sample in and get the lab analysis for it. You're going to need it to calculate that manure value anyway, and it's better to know what you've applied, and Amy is going to talk about that a little bit more after a bit. We often focus mainly on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but you'll note that other nutrients that plants need are found in manure. Things like micronutrients, like zinc, is one in particular that we're going to talk a little bit more about when I do the example. When these nutrients are needed, they boost that manure value because the commercial varieties of those nutrients can be decreased, those costs can be really high, and so you can decrease that fertilizer cost by utilizing those nutrients in the manure. So I'm going to do a little demonstration on the manure value calculator, and and that's available at the web address shown here on the screen. Amy, would you type that address into the chat box so folks can grab it and save it for later? The calculator is essentially an Excel tool that helps determine the value of those manure nutrients. So you're going to use the calculator for your own manure or to figure out whether or not the product that you're looking at purchasing works for your field in an economical manner. So to do that, you're going to need a soil type and analysis. So you need to know a little bit about the field that you're working with, of course. You're going to need to know what kind of manure you have and what those test results are. And if you're looking at purchasing manure, maybe through a broker, you might have different choices. So to have those different analysis in front of you and compare those might be helpful. What the next crop is and how you plan on applying manure along with those recommendations for that next crop. You're going to need that information. And then you're going to need to know current fertilizer prices for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and zinc. Those are the 5 that we calculate in our manure value calculator. And then additionally, if you're calculating the value of manure for your own field and you're purchasing or paying someone for that application, you're also going to need to know that cost so that you can input it into the spreadsheet and get your total value. So this is what the spreadsheet actually looks like. I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to the Excel tool so we can go through that. So the blue boxes are, sorry about that. I wanted to mention, if you did download the slides or if you have those handy, the data that I'm going to be putting into these is available through those slides. And so you can compare what I wrote in there, what I'm writing in here, to what that soil analysis is, what that manure analysis is, and that kind of thing. So that is available to you as well, but I'm just going to punch in the numbers here. The blue boxes here are data inputs, and I have already filled in a little bit of information about my field and where I got my manure from. The yellow boxes are drop-down menus. So you can choose from the various different crops here, whether or not it's continuous corn and if the soil is sandy. I know that I'm fertilizing for this year's corn crop after last year's soybeans. So we're in a corn soybean rotation and I'm going into corn. We did have the field grid sampled this last fall, and I'm going to use the average for this example so that I can kind of get an idea of what that manure is worth on this area of the field. And if you look at my manure or my soil sample, you'll notice it's only about a 40-acre area. So that's just one section of the field. So that's what it is for that particular section. The field is pretty calcareous, so I'm using the Olsen P test. A lot of people use the Spray 1 or the Malick 3, but I'm using Olsen because I can actually see that calcium on the surface of my soil. So that Olsen test shows that I have 16.4 parts per million phosphorus. I have 236 parts per million potassium, 5.24 parts per million sulfur, and 3.07 parts per million of the zinc. So that's where you put the soil test in over here. You're going to put the nitrogen, or sorry, the manure sample in this row here. And on the nitrogen, or sorry, on the manure sample, you're looking at that as-is basis. We don't apply manure on a dry basis, so we're always going to look at that as-is column. So that as-is column reports in pounds per ton, and I have 0.1 pounds of ammonium nitrogen per ton of manure. I have 13.7 pounds of organic nitrogen, meaning a total of 13.8 pounds of total nitrogen. Then I have 8.7 pounds of P2O5, 17.5 pounds of K2O, and 1.9 pounds of sulfur. And then I have just a little bit of zinc at 0.1 pounds of that zinc. Now, I said before that I have already filled in a little bit of information here. I filled in my nutrient recommendations here. You can fill in yours there when you're doing this. So after filling in those recommendations, it comes out and it tells us that if we were going to apply our manure at a rate to meet nitrogen needs, we would need to apply 25.5 tons of manure per acre. That seems a little excessive to me, knowing that I'm probably going to put on some starter fertilizer, and so I don't want to over apply my nitrogen. I'm going to choose 20 tons per acre just to see how that turns out. So the next step then is and Amy will go into this availability of nutrients more here. So I'm going to kind of skip over that, but we're going to go ahead and put in our fertilizer costs. I called our local fertilizer dealer on Tuesday as I was preparing this and got these prices. You'll see that data is also in my slides there. So I've got $1.02 for nitrogen, and I chose urea primarily because if we were applying on a day like today, your options are pretty limited. You might be applying urea. Ideally, you're going to probably wait until closer to when that crop needs it, but for today, that's what we're going to use. And when I called the fertilizer dealer, she didn't even think that I could get UAN if I wanted it, so I didn't figure that was probably a great number to use either. So for phosphorus, I've got 91 cents. I've got 67 cents for potassium, 56 cents for sulfur, and $2.78 for zinc. So that gives you manure values nutrient values. So just the nitrogen alone is worth about $140, $160 worth of phosphorus. And since I didn't need the potassium and sulfur, there's no value to those. But the zinc is needed on my field. And so I've got a short $6 worth of zinc there on a per acre basis. Now, we also talked about earlier that there is a possibility of a yield bump. Line 12 allows you to try and calculate that in a little bit. I'm going to be pretty conservative. I'm only going to put 1 year in, knowing that it probably will be more over the next several years, but I want to give myself a little bit of slack here, and I'm only going to give us 1 year. My field hasn't had manure for close to 10 years, so I am pretty likely to get some kind of a yield bump, but it's really hard to know exactly how much that is. I'm going to put in $5 5 bushels an acre there. And corn price today, when I looked at the co-op here, was $5.76, and so that's figures in about $30 worth of yield bump that I'm going to be receiving, assuming that I get just a 5 bushel yield bump. Maybe you'll get more, maybe I'll get less. I'm not quite sure, but it gives you a chance to get a little bit of a idea of what that might give you. So also on Tuesday, when I was talking with the fertilizer dealer and trying to figure out my manure costs or my fertilizer costs, I called a consultant that does manure brokering and asked him, so what are people getting for manure nowadays? And he told me just exactly what I expected to hear. It's all over the board with fertilizer prices like they are. He said that it was anywhere from $4 to $12 a ton. So I'm going to go right down the middle of that and figure out $8 a ton at 20 tons an acre comes out to be about $160. So that leaves our manure value, well, on a per ton basis, it leaves this manure value at almost $17 a ton. So if you were trying to sell your manure, you might be able to get that amount. I'm going to guess probably not, because people are going to have to factor in this hauling and spreading costs. But that's the number that you could use to get an idea of where you might be in nutrient wise. But if you're using that manure for your own fields, this number here, this net value of manure per acre, is the dollars saved essentially in using as compared to commercial fertilizer. And you'll note here that I do still have 30 pounds of nitrogen that I need to apply and 8 pounds per acre of zinc that I need to apply. But those are things that can be supplemented pretty easily. So that is my little introduction to the manure value calculator. Again, that link should be in the chat box. If it's not there, I will get it there shortly. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amy, who's going to talk to us about manure availability.
All right, thanks, Leslie. So as she's getting back to, okay, so here's the first slide that I'm going to start talking on. So one of the concerns, I guess one of the barriers sometimes to people using manure in a cropping system is that it's not as predictable as inorganic fertilizer, right? So if you buy an organic fertilizer, you know that nitrogen is available to your crop now, or if you put it on when the soil is cold, then when it gets up to the right temperature and the microbes start working in the soil, then it's going to be available to your plants. So it's a little bit more comforting to know exactly what is there and how quickly it will become available to your crops. Manure is a little bit tricky in that sense. And so we're just going to talk through about this. How do you determine what's available right now to your crop, or a year from now, or 2 years from now? Because one of the unique aspects of manure, in addition to it providing more than just nutrients to your field, it's providing organic matter and organisms that populate the soil and help break down organic matter in the soil. One of its unique characteristics is that there's some nutrients available right now and there's some that become available over time. So you have some residual effect of that, that manure. So Leslie, I'll let you go to the next slide. So these are some typical nutrient concentrations in manure. Anytime we share typical concentrations, we always want to make sure to say that the best data you're going to get is from a recent manure analysis and a sample that's been collected in a way that gives you a good representative idea of what's in the manure. So whether you are looking at solid manure, beef manure that's in a pile, you'll want to sample at multiple locations and depths along that pile, because it's different on the outside than it is on the very inside, different from top to bottom. If you're looking at a liquid storage system, whether that's a slurry tank or an earthen basin, it depends whether or not you're just taking effluent out of that earthen basin. If you're including the sludge in a slurry, you want to get that product mixed up when the sample is taken, so you have a good representation of what the mean nutrients available are across that product. So these are just kind of typical ones that I wanted to share. Leslie, I'll let you go to the next one here. So like I said, in manure, some nutrients are available right away and others are released more slowly. So what that comes down to in manure is the inorganic fractions of nutrients versus the organic fractions of nutrients. So when you apply fertilizer, you're applying an inorganic fertilizer product. It's available right away. Plants can use it. An organic form of that nutrient is tied up in the organic matter of the manure product that's being applied. And so in order for that nutrient to be available for plants to use, we need some microbiological activity going on in the soil that those microbes consume the organic matter. And as they do, what they're excreting is an inorganic form of that nutrient. So it is available to the crop. So when we think about determining what's available from a manure product, we have a NEB guide that's that I showed up here, 1335. And what we do in there is we try to offer that calculation. How do I figure out how much is available based on what I've applied? And so we have the total manure nutrients that are produced. We lose nutrients, particularly nitrogen, from that manure based on how we handle it. And then what's left over are the nutrients that are available to the crops. So you can skip ahead to the next one there, Leslie, and we'll talk about the table here. So these values were just updated in the past year. And sometimes when we update information recommendations like this, we hear grumbles. Sometimes we hear people being happy about the updates. What I would say is that we base these numbers on multiple years of data, multiple projects that are conducted. And so when the numbers change, it's not that we feel like we want to limit how much manure is being applied. It's more, well, we've learned a lot more over the last 10 or 15 years. And we realize that maybe the numbers we've been using aren't quite as accurate. So we do leave that open to individual consultants or producers to say, you know, I think the availability is a little higher or a little lower than what you've suggested in your recommendations. And if you have a good reason for that, then you can certainly make that adjustment with your calculations. But what we have here, we're looking at this manure nitrogen. So we have two fractions, the fraction that's in the urine or the liquid portion of the manure, and the fraction that's in the feces or the solid part of manure. So what's in the urine is ammonium nitrogen, readily available. When you walk into an area where manure is stored and you smell ammonia, it's because that ammonia is it's volatilizing. It's very active. It's easily broken down. It's being released from that manure. The problem, I guess the good and the bad, is one, it's readily available to the crops when you land apply it. Two, it can be lost fairly easily through storage or handling. So we have to be really careful about determining what amount of ammonia nitrogen in manure is actually going to be there for the crops. So if we inject manure or we surface apply it and get it incorporated right away, we're going to hold on to most of that ammonia nitrogen. So you can see up in the left-hand corner where it says side dress application, if it's injected, 95% of what's in that manure on the manure analysis report, we can expect that to be available to the crops. If we look at the kind of right-hand side of that ammonium nitrogen table, then we start seeing how much of that we lose over time, depending on how the manure is land applied. So again, if we put it on and we get it incorporated right away, we still have almost all of that ammonia nitrogen that was in the initial analysis. If we wait a day to incorporate it with solid manure, we've lost about half of that ammonia. With liquid manure, about 30% of it we've lost. So we've got 70% remaining of what was initially there. And as we go on down further, or more days out from that application before it's incorporated, we continue to lose ammonia nitrogen. So, so these values are offered so that you can kind of look at your data and say, I've got two types of nitrogen. I've got ammonia and I've got organic. I'm going to land apply it in this way, and I'm going to assume I have about 50% of that organic or that ammonia nitrogen available in my crop based on what's in my sample. And then I've got this much organic nitrogen available. And if we look at that table, that tells us how quickly do the microbes, can they be expected to break that down and make that organic nitrogen into a form that's available to the plants. So this is where we get the kind of residual effect of manure that we don't see with inorganic fertilizer. We get some available right away, and we get the organic that becomes available over time. So when you are looking at that, that application rate from year to year, you need to account for how much of that organic nitrogen is going to become available during this cropping season right after I've applied the manure. And then how much of it's going to be available next year and the year after that, and take that into account as you do that nutrient calculation each year of your nutrient management plan for that crop. Go ahead and switch to the next one, Leslie. So just kind of recapping on nitrogen, the ammonium nitrogen that you apply, that comes from your manure analysis report. So as Leslie mentioned, we use the as-is data. So you'll have the dry basis and as received. I think there's a number, you may have a number of different columns there, but the one we want to use is the as-is. And a lot of your reports will also say off to the side, available first year. And so you should see in there what they're predicting would be available in organic nitrogen that first year of application. So when we think about beef manure, if you think back to Leslie's calculation, I think she said 0.1 pounds of ammonium nitrogen per ton. So very tiny amount of ammonia nitrogen available that year for the crop. But the following year, or I guess with the organic nitrogen, I think she was around 13.7 pounds per ton. Okay, so then we think about, well, 40% of that is probably going to be available this year when I land apply. So we're talking, what, six pounds of nitrogen per ton that will be available this year from that organic nitrogen. And then we have to think, okay, next year, about 20% of that nitrogen will be available. And then after that, about 10%. And so it tapers off over time. And so the point is, we have to be kind of careful about how much credit we actually give in the first year to nitrogen that's available to the crop that year from our manure application. And these values, again, the ammonium and the organic, those are going to come from your manure analysis report. I'll let you skip ahead, Leslie. We do have in that guide sheet that I shared earlier, the G1335, we do have an actual Excel spreadsheet, kind of like what Leslie showed for the manure value calculation, that you can go through and calculate nitrogen and phosphate and potash availability. I didn't want to go through those today since it's kind of a tedious process and it's not real exciting to watch someone work through those calculations, but that is available. And we're happy to help you run through that calculation if you would want some help with it. But essentially, we've talked about nitrogen availability after manure is applied, phosphate and potash. A lot of times we don't think about there being an availability factor for those, but usually phosphate, there's about 70% of that available in the first year that it's land applied. So that's your phosphorus. And then potash, about 80% is available in that first year. So, so while Leslie's calculation that she went through is showing exactly what's in there and what it's valued at, some of that value is spread out over time based on what's available this year versus next year versus the following year. So these are, again, you get the phosphate and the potash values from your manure analysis report, and the guide sheet G1335 steps you through figuring out what's available this year and the next couple of years in terms of my nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that's in the manure. Let's go to the next one, Ashley. So, Leslie, I'm sorry. So this last part I want to talk about, we work with a lot of livestock producers who operate systems that have an operating permit. So they're large enough that they're required to have a permit to operate in the state of Nebraska. And if you're not among that audience of producers, you should know that their permit requires that they have a nutrient management plan that says, for every field, for every manure storage, here's the nutrients that are needed, here's the nutrients supplied, here's what I'm growing, here's what I predict as yield, here's what I got as a yield, to kind of do a good nutrient balance on those fields and really understand what's needed and what's being utilized by the crops. They also have requirements in terms of how far they have to stay back from sensitive areas when they're land applying manure, whether that's wells or surface water bodies. And so those rules that are kind of heavily regulated on the permitted operations still really should apply to the non-permitted operations or to a crop farm that's accepting manure from a livestock farmer and going to apply that. So we kind of talk about this as minding your manure manner. So it's sort of that you don't really have a permit telling you what to do. You don't have a nutrient management plan that you're turning into the state and reporting on every year, but you really should be doing the things that the permitted operations are being required to do, right? Because our goal is use the manure nutrients efficiently and prevent contamination of ground and surface water. And that's really what the regulations are set out to do. So if you go to the next slide, Leslie, I put up a few of our different social media and print products that we've put out recently. And the first one, the middle one, is just mind your manure manner. So it's kind of a list of do's and don'ts. And probably most importantly is manage that manure as a nutrient source. There's no value in over applying nutrients that aren't going to be used. Just like Leslie mentioned, you don't get any value out of potash in manure if your cropland doesn't need that application that particular growing season. We want to target soils that need phosphorus and potassium. We get a lot more value out of the manure if we need more than just the nitrogen that's in it. Making manure number one is kind of one of our pushes for helping people think through, could I save money and could I improve the environment in this agricultural production area by first recycling manure nutrients that are available to me locally, and then bringing in inorganic fertilizer to supplement what is still needed. So we certainly don't want to give the impression that manure can do it all or that inorganic fertilizer can do it all, but we really think those two complement each other quite well. And when we get the nutrients and the organic matter from manure, we know we'll probably have to supplement some inorganic fertilizer there, and that's completely fine. We just want to help farmers recognize the value of what's available locally to be recycled as a nutrient on their farm. We want to see farmers conserve nitrogen. Obviously, nitrogen only has value if it sticks around and is available to the plants. So again, injecting, incorporating different ways that we can keep the ammonia from volatilizing from that manure before the plants have a chance to use it. And of course, we want to protect water. So on the left-hand side here is our manure setbacks that are required for animal feeding operations in the state. So if you're a large or permitted animal feeding operation, you have to either stay 100 feet back from surface water or wells or tile lines with your manure application, or you could have a vegetative buffer, so a grass filtered area that's 35 feet wide, and then you can apply that much closer. So you gain 65 feet of application area around the outside edge of your field when you use that that grass buffer. For a small and medium operation, the setback is 30 feet, regardless of what sort of interventions you have at the edge of the field. So we would just encourage a crop farmer who's accepting manure for application, you know, it's really not in anybody's interest for you to apply that right up to the edge of a stream or some surface water body, because we feel fairly confident based on research that you're going to have runoff and discharges of nutrients and contaminants, surface discharges of those when it's that close. On the right-hand side, this is kind of a card that we put together in collaboration with Nutrient Advisors and Sechi Agri-Services, kind of intended for to be shared with a farmer who is receiving manure from a livestock producer and going to use that on their crop farm. So again, this comes back to the sort of do unto others as you would have done unto you, our golden rule. One is be a good neighbor. So if you're going to stockpile manure, think about where best to put that so that it's not, the wind isn't carrying that odor right to a neighbor's property. You know, keep it back from wells and surface water areas, have a way to contain any runoff that might come from that. When you get ready to spread manure, or if you have manure stockpiled, let's not leave it there for 6 months to a year. One, it's an odor source, right, for your nearby neighbors, but two, the longer it sits there, the less nutrient value is remaining in there. And so if you're going to spend the money and you're going to get that manure, let's get it put on in a timely fashion so that we're realizing the value of the nutrients that are there. Again, we want to protect water quality. We want to stay back from surface water bodies and wells and tile inlets so that we don't encourage discharges of those nutrients into surface water. And again, going back to the NEB guide we've been talking about, we want to maximize the value of manure. So let's understand what's in there and what the crop needs, and then handle it and apply it accordingly. So let's go to the next slide, Leslie. Just a couple more here to wrap up. Trying to drive home this idea that there's no value in over applying nutrients or applying nutrients that aren't needed. So that's why we have the tools available that we do. The first one that Leslie talked about, if we know what our soils have and we know what the manure has and what our crop needs, maybe the manure source we're using has things that we don't necessarily need. They're still going to be in there, obviously. You're still going to get zinc or phosphate, potassium, things in there that maybe you don't need as much of. But you can consider, like, is there a better field to put this on where I do need those nutrients, and therefore I'm realizing more of the value of that manure because I'm using all of the nutrients that are available to me. So over applying, doesn't really gain you anything, and it's you're losing value of the manure by putting on nutrients that aren't needed by your crop. Next slide, Leslie. So it kind of comes down to, like we've talked about here, knowing what your crops need, getting a soil test, and getting a nutrient recommendation for your upcoming crop, understanding what the manure provides by having a nutrient analysis done, and by understanding what's available now versus over time based on how I handle it, how it's stored, how it's applied. Know what rate you want to apply. And then probably the most important is, just because you think you're applying at a certain rate doesn't mean you necessarily are. So we always encourage applicators to calibrate their equipment. I don't have it in here, but we've got data showing we can be pretty darn consistent in what's in the manure that we're applying. But if we're not consistent in how much is being applied based on our settings, our application rates are all over the board. So it's really to your advantage and your ability to get the most value out of manure to know that you're putting it on at the rate that you intend to apply it. One more slide here, Leslie. And so just kind of things to think about: what affects the rate of application versus uniformity, the speed at which you're traveling, the condition of equipment. We've had a situation where a farmer we were doing some calibrations and they unloaded one load of beef manure and we got a certain rate. And then he came back and he said he had all the settings the same and we find that our rate's twice as high. And then he realized, well, I forgot to shift into second gear. So I wasn't going as fast as I was that first time that I was out there. So just simple things like that can really impact and are things to think about as far as the rate of application and the uniformity that you want to see with a manure application. So I think the next slide, J, is a little bit of discussion on rates of return. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Parsons for that.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. And Amy and Leslie asked me to say a little bit about just calculating rates of return on a manure investment, if you want to think it like that, because we hear those that type of terminology being used when people talk about applying manure and looking at the return that they get for it. So I put together this simple slide with just a couple of talking points to think through. One of them is this terminology return on investment, or ROI, which a lot of us have heard about. And it's important to realize that obviously the two things you need there are returns over time, but you also need an initial investment. So matter of fact, mathematically, you can't even calculate an ROI unless you have initial negative outflow, and then at some point in time in the future you have the positive payback from that. It could be a stream over a period of years, or it could be one-time payment sometime in the future. I say that because the example, the numbers that Leslie was running in the market environment today, where you do a comparison of what the manure is actually replacing in terms of cost of your other fertilizer, could come out positive. And in that case, you couldn't even actually calculate an ROI on the manure application today, because it's a positive, and the net effects of that application today are positive in the future. So that can be a difficult thing to calculate in some situations. So when could you calculate an ROI? Well, certainly there's times where those numbers aren't going to work out, and whether it's a residual effect, or what's actually available in that first year, or just the cost of fertilizer itself compared to manure and so on, you could end up with a negative initial investment. And then as they mentioned, some of that nutrients become available in subsequent years, and there's positive effects there. Positive effects on soil quality and things like that. So it could make sense to make that initial manure application, even though it doesn't net out in a trade-off with fertilizer initially as a positive, because later on you do get positive returns and a positive ROI results from that. The other thing would be somebody who's not doesn't have the equipment, but wants to purchase equipment or make another one-time investment into actually applying manure. So they have some initial upfront costs that they need to get payback from over time. So those are the two situations where an ROI could be calculated. It makes sense to calculate if you want to do it that way. The other thing I will mention is that return on assets is another way to look at this. And this is a little bit different mindset, but of course, this is just your return on the assets that you have involved in the operation. History has shown that if you look in ag in general, over say a 10 or 20 year time span, this hovers right around a 7% return. It'll bounce a little up and below, but usually it's somewhere in that 6 to 8% return if you look at a 10-year span over time. That's actually split up though into a couple of different things. One of them is the current income that's coming in on the assets, and the other thing is the capital gains on those assets. In particular with land values. And turns out that capital gains generally makes up about 2/3 of that return on assets over time. So the income is a smaller part of that. The increase in value of the assets is a larger part of that. And when you think about that in the context of applying manure, another way to think about that is just increasing the productivity value of your assets, your land in particular, and doing that over the long haul. So over the long haul, you're actually could be increasing that return that you get on the asset. So you do that in a given year, but you're also increasing the value of that land by increasing its productivity, its soil health, and so on and so forth, all those other aspects of it over the long haul. So it's another way to think about it in terms of what you're doing, and it meshes up a little bit more in terms of some of the conversations of soil conversations in particular about why you might want to apply manure. So I just wanted to add that in there, and welcome any questions at the end that you might have on some of the economics of it. And Amy, I know you have some teamwork slides here at the end.
Yeah, just a couple more slides to wrap up. I wanted to make everybody aware of the animal manure management team through Nebraska Extension. So a lot of times you hear from myself and Leslie at meetings, but we have a whole team of individuals, both on campus as specialists, off campus as statewide educators, and as regional educators, who are working on the content that you see come out on the website and through our social media. And so I just want to recognize everybody that's part of that team that makes that possible for us. And then the final slide, I've put up my contact information as well as Leslie's, and I'd encourage you to reach out to us after today if you have questions. But we're happy to take your questions now as well. So we will wrap up and take questions if you have them.
Okay, and you can type your questions either into the Q&A box or the chat box. We do have some that have come in, and I'll go ahead and ask the first one, which is, how can animal producers connect with interested crop farmers? Suggestions on making that connection.
Yeah, that's a really great question. One way is to contact a manure broker. There are a number of them across the state. The way I would start with connecting with them is actually last spring, the manure team actually released an app that you can put on your phone that allows you to make connections with not only manure brokers, but also our manure team, as well as the regulatory folks and people in our CS that have some relation to manure work, and as well as manure applicators that are actually out there for hire. If you're looking to, if you have manure, you've found somebody that will sell you manure, but you don't have the equipment to haul that to your site, you can connect with those as well. You can find that actually on our manure.unl.edu homepage. There's a quick link to the manure app, and that'll take you right to it, and you should be able to find it there. So that's the best way that I can offer. Otherwise, talk up with your neighbors and figure out what works best. The coffee shop's not a bad place in that respect.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Leslie, because sometimes I don't realize that neighbors aren't talking to each other. And somebody says, I've been wanting manure, but I have no idea where to get it. And then they find out a neighbor down the road is like, I have manure, I just don't know if anybody wants it. So just, kind of talking and word of mouth to find out who's got that they're willing to part with, that they would like to sell or even give away. So don't underestimate the power of connecting with your neighbors.
Yeah, knocking on doors, I suppose, in the right neighborhood anyway, wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Okay, another question on incorporating the manure into the soil. If you're no-till farmer, does it make sense to not incorporate? You mentioned earlier, I know I'm connecting it to stuff you said earlier in terms of what nutrients are available. But also they asked a question on the manure manners notion of incorporating or not incorporating things there to consider.
Yeah, so in the manure world, we kind of started contradicting ourselves several years ago when we always used to say inject, incorporate, get that manure under the soil surface as quickly as you can so that you reduce odor and you limit nitrogen loss from it. And then we started seeing the move towards no-till, and farmers kind of thought, I have to make a decision. Do I use manure or do I use no-till? Because they don't seem compatible with each other. One thing that I would say in terms of beef manure, you're not losing a whole lot of nitrogen by leaving that on the surface because there's not a lot of inorganic nitrogen there to begin with. So if beef manure is being surface applied, you still are getting most of that value in terms of the organic nitrogen that becomes available over time, and the phosphorus and potassium in that manure. And you're getting a lot of organic matter. So to me, that is really a high value that we see in beef feedlot manure. If you're using a poultry litter or a layer manure, I would probably encourage you to at least do some light tillage to get that under the soil surface after it's been applied. With food manure, we're lucky that we have equipment, we can just inject it, and with very minimal disturbance, we get that under the soil surface and down where that nitrogen is protected. But what I will say, I was, many of you know Aaron Hurd with NRCS, and we were actually at a event together recently, and I overheard him talking about it's not the worst thing to till a field every 4 or 5 years. And I kind of like looked around and said, oh my gosh, did I hear you right, Aaron? Like, are you actually, because he talks a lot about soil health, and he kind of smiled and he was like, I was expecting that from you. But it's not, I don't think it's the end of the world to do a light tillage every 4 or 5 years. And when we're talking beef manure in particular, it 3-4 years of phosphorus out of an application when we're trying to meet nitrogen needs. So put it on, till it in, get it in contact with the soil, and then don't come back to that field for 3-4, maybe even 5 years with beef manure, because all you need right now is that supplemental nitrogen and maybe some of your micronutrients, because you've met phosphorus needs for several years. So that would be my response. And Leslie or Jay, you might have something to add there.
No, I would just, I am slightly surprised to hear that from Aaron myself, but I have heard that from other soil health folks as well. That once in a while it's okay as long as it's not real deep.
Yeah, we should see if he's on before we talk about it.
I don't see his name, but you can all let him know I was talking about it and kind of make fun there.
So there is a follow-up, and you touched on it. Somebody asked, has Nebraska been looking into low disturbance manure injection? And I know you touched on that just now, but maybe explain to folks what that means and stuff.
Yeah, so I would say there are low disturbance injection equipment for liquid and slurry manures currently, whether it's knifing in or some of the airway injectors, other ones that, whether they actually create an opening in the soil that manure is applied to and then it falls back in, or whether they're poking holes that liquid manure then flows down into. But I don't know that we've reached that point with any of our solid manure products. And a lot of times I feel like the thing that holds us back is we need to add moisture to a solid to get it to flow in a way that we could apply it underneath the soil surface. And it's kind of the cardinal sin of manure production or manure management to add moisture to manure, because that just makes it more expensive to haul. You're at your more weight attributed to water and nutrients. So I know we have what I would consider a low disturbance method of applying solid manure.
And the next question is, you got the transport up here. How far can you manure be hauled? I know that's a loaded question, but
it is. I did see one question ahead of that I wanted to mention, because it's a really easy question for me to answer. It was going back to that calculator, if they were asking if I was using the commercial fertilizer price per pound or if I was using the actual nutrient per pound. And I was using the actual cost of the nutrient per pound. So you can see, I did put that up on the screen so you can see that. As far as how far can manure be hauled, Amy just mentioned the liquid portion. The wetter it is, the less distance it can go, pretty much, because you're hauling water. So that's the big thing with how far it can be hauled. And then it just depends, if you have a field that really needs some of the nutrients from manure, you're going to get a lot of those benefits that I talked about, those intrinsic benefits that maybe you can't put a number on. You can haul it a lot further if you have that field that is going to utilize those those benefits better than, you know, your field across the road that's had manure every year for the last 50 years or something. You're not going to get a lot of benefit out of that. And so you can definitely go further than that. So it depends. Typical.
Yeah, and I would add
answer
to that, it also depends on whether or not the person providing manure is needing to get rid of it or wanting to get rid of it. And if you're not paying for the actual manure, or if you're not paying for the nutrients in it, you're just paying to haul it, well, then you can take all that value you're getting from the manure nutrients and put that into hauling it a little bit farther. So maybe you can go 10 miles with it because you're not actually paying for the manure, you're just paying to get it to your site. So there's just a lot of factors that come into play there, and it's kind of becomes a negotiation strategy to figure out, am I going to pay for the nutrients and to move it a long way, or can I get the manure for free and I can afford to haul it further?
Yeah, great answer there. And of course, water makes a big difference. The other thing I would add to that from an economic standpoint is the loading and then the application side of that. Those are kind of fixed pieces to that. And of course, those can vary quite a bit in terms of who's loading it out and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different factors to take into consideration there in terms of how far you can actually afford to take it. But obviously, the shorter the distance, the better in general. But okay, I don't see any other questions that have come in here. We're getting close to the top of the hour. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up here. And thank everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted on our Center for Agricultural Profitability website. That URL is cap.unl.edu. You can also register for any of our upcoming webinars there. And of course, these take place Thursday at noon, usually every week. You can see our schedule up online. And I do believe that I heard Leslie say earlier that they're going to, once that recording becomes available, which should be sometime later today or early tomorrow morning, they're going to embed it into their website, the Manure website also. Did I hear you say that, Leslie? So
that is correct. That's the plan.
So either one of those places you can get it. We hope you'll join us next Thursday when we will be joined by the Nebraska Farm Service Agency to discuss farm program details, decisions, and directions for 2022. We have a lot of questions on that. People have a lot of questions on that. And so Farm Service Agency will be joining us and we'll address a lot of those. And please click the link in the chat box to take a brief 3-question survey that provides feedback on today's webinar and helps inform our upcoming webinar sessions. We're always looking for ideas, either on topics or speakers that we can invite to be a part of these programs. And we really appreciate Amy and Leslie joining us today and sharing their expertise. And we appreciate all of our listeners joining us and taking it all in. And wish everybody a good day and enjoy the weather while we got it here. Sounds like it's going to get cold for the weekend.
Thanks, Jay.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.